can post it later. So we begin. I don't think I've ever preached on the book of Proverbs, and there's probably good reason for that. It doesn't exactly flow from one thing to another. It's hard to find enough of a text to really build a sermon on, maybe, but we're going to be looking at Proverbs today. So our sermon series on questions that are found in the Bible continues, and we're going to focus on a question that comes from Proverbs 18:14. But rather than just spend a whole study on one question, we're going to look a little bit more at what Proverbs are at the book and a little bit more at this chapter, which is, I'll warn you now, and this might be a spoiler on one of my questions, it feels totally disjointed, and I'm not sure that it isn't totally disjointed, but we'll figure all that stuff out. So as we begin, do you have a favorite witty saying or piece of wisdom? Do you remember where you picked it up or who first said it to you? And where does it apply in your life?
Hello.
Yes, Pat.
Okay. This morning, Dave and I were talking about something, and I said, nevertheless, she persisted. And that's my most recent favorite.
Little phrase, nevertheless, she persisted. So sometimes, Pat, how does that apply to your life when you apply that to yourself? When do you find yourself thinking those things, that kind of saying?
Sometimes if what I'm trying to say isn't being heard and I have to restate it and use different words, which doesn't always get accepted well, but usually that's the kind of thing. I
hear you. Very good.
One we use a lot this year is we can do hard things. That's just been on repeat, really for the last few years with kids, especially, this is hard. Well, we can do hard things. Like, it's just.
Yeah.
That's good, Michelle. And Dick, did I see your hand or were you adjusting
Yes,
something?
I may have said this before, so you can stop me, but one of the things that I remember is a radio minister who I liked very much, and he was talking about a friend of his who was a Bible expert, but he always worried about money. This is a minister who always worried about money. And his wife, although she never read the Bible, had the real sense of what Christianity was all about. So when he would get going crazy because he worried that he couldn't pay his bills and so on, and this minister, and his wife would say to him, just lean into Jesus. And it was such a great figurative kinds of response, because when you hear that and you do that, many things come to your focus that are not so bad at that particular time. So I would say that was an opening eye for me.
So a piece of wisdom that's faith related in that case, Dick. So that's wonderful. So yes, Eileen, mom,
yes. I think I've mentioned before, I had this friend in Cleveland she was sort of I was asked to visit her weekly, and she lived alone in a mobile home, and she had aphorisms taped to every surface in her kitchen and her house. But her favorite was, this too shall pass. And she would go around like the little engine that could, this too shall pass, this too shall pass, this too shall pass. And it does,
Right.
However, one of my friends, in Iowa, one of my friends from college gave me this, and it probably is backwards. This is one of the things that doesn't pass. This too shall pass. It's that it does add a little levity to our expectations, but then she also gave me this. It says, be realistic, expect a miracle. So those are kind of fun.
Different wit and wisdom. So
and Chris, stuff that came up with our search committee when we were looking for you was in God's time, just to help us kind of with, and Joyce, we go through this all the time Thursday nights with patience Of just being patient. In God's time, it will work out, as long as Dick said, lean on God.
Yeah, so there's a lot of sayings that are helpful to us, whether it applies to our faith or just applies to our perspective on life, right? I think of, I love to do carpentry projects with my son, and I always think of the carpenter's motto.
Measure twice.
Measure twice,
Measure
cut
twice.
once.
Not once, right? So, which sounds simple, but it just reminds us, and not just in carpentry, but think it through before you do it, because once you do it, it's hard to undo it, right? So, so those kind of things. So these things are proverbs that we deal with every day in our lives. So there are a lot of proverbs that aren't necessarily from the Bible that inspire us or just help us think through different parts of our life. So if I were to ask you, maybe what I just said is part of that, but if I were to ask you, what's a proverb? What would you say? If somebody said, I don't know what a proverb is, what's a proverb?
A wise saying, a
Good advice.
Good advice, a wise saying.
Would you go as far as platitude?
I don't know. Sometimes maybe they overlap sometimes. So the book of Proverbs in the Bible, on the sheet I send out, I tell you, it's unlike anything else in the Bible. It is a very different style of literature. So we lump it with Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon and the Psalms into wisdom literature. That's what we call it, but it's very different from anything else. Psalms are poetry, and Proverbs is not necessarily poetic. It's just Proverbs. So that's what this collection is. So in your opinion, what do you think, what would be a purpose of a book like this in the community of ancient Israelites?
Guidelines.
Guidelines? Is that what you said,
Live
Doc?
by, yeah, guidelines to live by.
So if I asked you, for those who have a kind of a familiarity with different books of the Bible, if I asked you what the purpose of Genesis or Leviticus or Isaiah or First Chronicles were, if any of those books ring a bell, and you can think of what they contain, what are some other purposes of those kind of books? They're all different, by the way. This isn't a trick question.
Those other ones are more historical.
Yeah.
First Chronicles definitely is. First Chronicles is a history book. And that's probably its intention, was to record the history of the Israelites of that period.
Like Leviticus, isn't it more like a law?
Laws.
Leviticus is filled with laws on how to live in community and be righteous as you do so, right? So Leviticus is a law book. What about Isaiah? What's Isaiah full of?
Prophecies.
That's a turbulent time in the history of Israel. God speaks in through Isaiah to the people in power to try and help them to correct their behavior and to figure out how to live in right relationship with God. That Isaiah is filled with some tough words to hear, right? Genesis is a big narrative of the creation and the early history of God's people and how it all began. And then you got Proverbs, words to live by, rules for living, right?
Well, there was something in something that I read that one part of it sort of divided, and whenever wisdom is talked about, it's a she, and they sort of personify wisdom as female. But it was also that one section of this. And one section starts the first chapter 2, my child. Every set of verses starts with my child, like poetry, so that you sort of follow my child, do this, my child, if you accept my words, my child, this, my child, do not despise the Lord's discipline. And then there was one section that supposedly started with the letters of the Hebrew alphabet in order. Well, of course, since I don't know Hebrew and our reverend has studied it, perhaps that will be more familiar to you.
Or you could just read question 4 where that is stated, Mother. So yes.
Speak Hebrew to us.
So, yeah,
Oh, yeah, since the world is made by wisdom, all those who follow, let's see that, oh, sorry, that was.
but we'll get to some of that too. But before we get to what the style is, the point of the book, it's important to understand, you know, Isaiah is for a turbulent time in history. Chronicles is to record all the ups and downs of history. Proverbs, you know, some of the books were like, well, that seems like it's to an audience in exile. Proverbs seems to be in a settled period of life where we're just trying to figure out what are good rules for living. This is not, and interestingly, a lot of these, God isn't mentioned at all. So sometimes Proverbs, you can't take more than one verse at a time without it switching themes. So I have commentaries, and the commentaries start by themes, like on money, on relationships with others, on relationships with God. And I'm like, oh, geez, this is really hard because they're jumping all over the place within the book of 31 chapters as they do that. But it makes sense. It's more, there's common themes that come up, but they're not necessarily grouped together. And we're going to talk about, too, the style that different Proverbs is written in. So, Mom, you already introduced 2 of them. One where there's a my child. It seems like a teacher offering advice to a student. One is a Hebrew acrostic. The last verses of Proverbs 31, verses 10 through 31, they each start with a different Hebrew letter of the alphabet if you were to read them in Hebrew so that they could be easily memorized. It's a poem. But that's not necessarily true of any of the other Proverbs. It just so happens that that's how Proverbs ends there. So, so if Proverbs is not a history of Israelite people, if Proverbs is not prophecy for a certain time or to be applied today too, if Proverbs is general guide for living for the ancient Israelites, does that make it more or less applicable today?
You know, I can look back when I was young, Proverbs was my favorite book in the Bible, and from like junior high on. And I think that was because I got bored and taken, you know, the history was so tedious and the New Testament was so familiar. The Proverbs kept challenging me with these sayings and with direction for, you know, how to be a person and what you should, how you could be, you know.
They're perhaps easier to live by than the 10 Commandments and all the laws of Leviticus. More about just being a good person as opposed to something more stringent from the 10 Commandments and such.
More positive instead of.
Yeah, maybe that too. Although there is some negative, so there is some Proverbs that are written in the negative. I should say, like "Thou shalt not." But Rick, you mentioned interesting. So in Leviticus, you know, like if your ox falls into your neighbor's ditch, what's the recompense for that? Like, I don't know that really has anything to do with my life today. But Proverbs, general sayings of just how to live with other people and yourself. Like you were saying, Mom, that applies across generations sometimes. So Proverbs is this really interesting book because it's quoted often in the New Testament. It's quoted often in our lives, but it's not one that we dive down into study or preaching on as often because it's just kind of, it's all over the place. It's scattershot instead of a focused one. So we're going to jump right in. There's not really a way to tackle this. So I wanted to look at the one question for my sermon this week. But I thought we would just take a little sample of some of the Proverbs in chapter 18. So we're going to read Proverbs 18, 1 through 5. Do we have a volunteer to read Proverbs? And, you know, folks, we spent 15 minutes just talking about the book of Proverbs, but I think that's important for us to understand what Proverbs is so that we know how to apply it to our lives. So I think that's a good foundation to start from. But anybody willing to read the first 5 verses of that chapter? Rick, thank you.
An unfriendly man pursues selfish ends. He defiles all sound judgment. A fool finds no pleasure in understanding, but delights in airing his own opinions. When wickedness comes, so does contempt, and with shame comes disgrace. The words of a man's mouth are deep waters, but the fountain of wisdom is a bubbling brook. It is not good to be partial to the wicked or to deprive the innocent of justice.
Thank you, Rick. So verse 1 in particular is very tricky to translate from Hebrew. So Rick, could you reread your verse 1, and then if somebody has a different translation?
An unfriendly man pursues selfish ends. He defiles all sound judgment. He defies all sound judgment.
Okay. And Carol, do you have a different one?
Yeah, I have the Message. And by the way, the Message says these are, the Proverbs are statements from, find it, statements from Solomon. Wise sayings from Solomon. Let's see, from 6, the words of a fool start flight. Oh, you want the same thing, Rick read.
18:1, yeah, the beginning of 18 if you have it.
Loners who care only for themselves split on common ground. Fools care nothing for thoughtful discord. All they do is run off at the mouth.
That's good. That's good enough, Carol. Just the first two is good. So mine says the one who lives alone is self-indulgent, showing contempt for all who have sound judgment. Mine makes it sound like you shouldn't live by yourself.
I didn't like this version, and that's mine too. Yeah.
But I think Rick's gets to the point a little bit better.
Unfriendly.
So living alone is not that you live in your own house. It's that you're like, I don't like these neighbors. I'm never going to talk to them. You know, I'm going to be the one who sits in the back pew in church. I'm going to come late and leave early because I don't want to talk to anybody. Like, you can sit in the back pew in the church, but a lot of our back pew sitters anyway, since my time, they're the ones who are getting in trouble talking to each other. You know? But
changed.
Yeah, you know, there's these people who just they don't want any part of anything else going on with anyone else. They just want to live on their own terms, and they don't want to be bothered by anybody else's stuff. So that's what it says. Like the NRSV version, it says living alone. That's very different than what the Hebrew's trying to get at, but it's a tricky translation. So
now mine, I think I've got the Teenage Bible, you know,
okay.
and it says, the selfish man quarrels against every sound principle of conduct, but by demanding his own way.
That's a good way of putting it too, Joyce. Like, I don't care how you do it. This is how I do it.
Mhm.
Like, don't put your social conventions on me. I don't have to say please and thank you. You know, this is just, you know, I'm going to do it my own way, and on you if you think differently. So how might this connect to verse 4? Verse 4 is also a tricky understanding here. What do you think verse 4 means?
That a wise man is thoughtful. Mine says a wise man's words express deep streams of thought.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I have a footnote that says the words of the mouth, the deep waters thing is like obscure or hard to understand.
So Joyce, I think your translation is actually misleading.
Yeah.
Really?
Because I think that's the opposite of what it's trying to tell you.
Uh-huh.
Because it says the words of the mouth are deep waters, and deep waters, the way I picture it is, if you were flying in a helicopter into the middle of ocean and got dropped off, you don't want to be anywhere close to deep waters. It's not going to be helpful. It's just, there's just too much there, and you can't make sense of it. You can't tell what's north, south, east, or west. You don't know where to swim to find land. You're lost in the ocean. The fountain of wisdom is a gushing stream or a babbling brook or something like that. Very different. Much more like, oh, look, in my backyard, I have this beautiful little creek. I can see the bounds of it. I understand how to understand it. I see where it flows. I see how far it is from one bank to the other. Totally different. and more manageable.
Yeah, and sometimes it's helpful to look at it as think before you speak, because you have a lot of, you're in the ocean. It's like there's a lot of water around you. You could just get overwhelmed and sink down into the abyss. But if you gather your wits about you and start floating, then you can decide if you're going to try to swim for help or swim somewhere. And it's sort of that way with our words sometimes.
And
as
maybe
you can tell,
words,
they just keep coming out.
maybe words, but how might it apply to listening, not
We
speaking?
don't do that well.
The words of the mouth are deep waters. The fountain of wisdom is a gushing stream. Here's what I get out of that verse. If nothing's coming to you, that wisdom should be understandable pretty easily. Oh, that's a wise thing.
Okay.
Or when somebody speaks in all different layers and you say, I'm not sure I even understand what you're getting at. I think you think you're deep, but it just sounds like you're confusing to me. And we've all heard that, right? So there's so many layers of rhetoric. It's meant to be unclear. It's not even meant to be clear. And I think that proverb kind of warns us that to beware of the deep waters, because deep waters aren't necessarily good here. Wisdom should be understandable. Otherwise, it's hard to apply to your life, right?
And maybe that's what the whole book of Proverbs is for, is to try to put all this stuff very succinctly and understandably.
So,
yes, and not everyone has the same ability to comprehend. And it's sort of a reminder to say it in a way that many people will understand, rather than just those who have gifted intelligence and advanced wisdom. Just make it simple enough for people to get it, to have a grasp on it.
Yes. I used to say, don't go so deep, just be shallow, just at the top level.
And it's one thing if you want to have a conversation with somebody else and really go deep on it. But if you're trying to impart understanding to other people, then it doesn't help to use your most obscure language possible or to talk around your issue. If my job as a minister, in some ways we study and we go very deep, but when I'm a communicator, when I'm trying to communicate something, simple is better. Trying to apply something, simple is better, because if I get too deep, I don't impart the point I'm trying to make, and sometimes I even confuse myself. Right? So putting on your own this crazy passage of verse 1, it's the kind of same thing for verse 4 for me, is that some people get really in their own deep water, and that's where they stay. Yeah. It's not helpful to anyone else. Right.
Well, and think back to Michelle's talking about these little piglets sort of going all over. If she were to stand there and give them wisdom, saying, well, now you shouldn't be doing that. Let me tell you how you need to behave now, or with children. But she sort of leads them. If they get lost, she'll maybe nudge them back into the area where the mother is, or the mother will go and find the little straggler. As Jesus often illustrated, finding that lost sheep. It's that.
But yeah, Jesus didn't talk about finding.
No, I shifted to sheep there. You didn't get that.
In conversations in the New Testament.
Throwing demons into them and casting them into the ocean or something.
So take a look at verse 5. How's that, the tone of verse 5? How's that different than some of the others? What's the theme of verse 5? If you were to not repeat what it says, but what is it concerned with?
Justice.
Justice, yeah.
So we have one that says, maybe it's talking about, like number 2 is very simple. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only expressing personal opinion. Yeah, we've all felt like that's a proverb that should be on the tip of our tongue sometimes when we hear people, speak before they think, right? But number 5 all of a sudden takes a total different direction. I'm concerned with justice now.
Well, And in 6, it's interesting. It says the words of fools start fights. Do him a favor and gag him.
Mine suggests invites a flogging.
Yeah, ours says a fool's mouth invites a flogging. So yeah, gag, that's fine too. But let's move into that. Well, in each section, I ask if any particular proverb stood out to you, but maybe we'll save that for the end. After we read through all these 15 verses, we'll discuss if any of them connected in particular. But would somebody be willing to read 6 to 10 for us?
I'll read it.
Thank you, Michelle.
The lips of fools bring them strife, and their mouths invite a beating. The mouths of fools are their undoing, and their lips are a snare to their very lives. The words of a gossip are like choice morsels, they go down to the inmost parts. One who is slack in his work is brother to one who destroys. The name of the Lord is a fortified tower. The righteous run to it and are safe.
Mine says the one who's slack in work is close kin to a vandal.
Ooh.
That sounds, I love that. That's poetic.
Kin to a vandal.
How are verses 6 and 7 alike? Notice in this particular one line is the next. Have some that sometimes they're parallel statements, sometimes they're opposite statements, sometimes there's metaphor. In verse 6 and 7, these are proverbs where one line amplifies the next one. So how are they similar?
Politicians here, you know, they're a good example of fools' lips bringing strife to some of the people, and really they should be silenced when they get that way.
Well, you can apply verse 6. How is it similar to verse 7? Not necessarily how does it apply to us, but how do these two things, you know, if verse 5 talks about justice.
This is back to justice.
It also says loose lips don't sink ships. Sometimes they get you a punch in the face. It sounds like, I mean, it's kind of inviting, like, hey, you should get what you give. So that's pretty, this is like playground justice here. If we're going to talk about justice in this one, which it's not, but you know, a fool's mouth invites a beating kind of thing that's pretty harsh.
But true.
Yeah, but I mean, geez, your kid could come home and what happened? I punched Billy on the playground. You did what? Well, it was said it in the Bible. He was saying foolish things. Like, oh no.
He was a fool.
Man, that you finally read some verses. You just read the wrong ones. You know, boy, I was trying to raise my kid right here. So verse 8 offers a simile or metaphor. That's the style of that proverb. So what is it concerned with in verse 8?
Rumors.
Rumors.
Mine says,
picture
what
does-
dainty morsels rumors are, they are eaten with great relish.
And isn't that the truth? I think, Michelle, yours says something similar to mine. They go down to the inmost parts. In other words, like, you know, you just embrace them so easily. Oh, those are delicious rumors, and I just embrace them so easily, you know?
Gossip is so tasty, how we love to swallow it.
How we love to swallow gossip. Yeah. What a great saying, you know, that proverb is, and how true in so many ways, right?
Yeah.
And we're going to read verses 11 through 15 next. Now, I want you to just take note because we're going to get back to this. Number 10, I will say, what do you get from number 10? What is that trying to tell you?
God is our refuge.
God is a refuge.
And I always think of the Jerusalem Bible always uses the word Yahweh in the Old Testament when it's like the name of Yahweh is a strong tower. It's like beyond our understanding. It's bigger than we are. It's the great Yahweh. It's sort of like a in the wind kind of God.
Yeah, so whenever you see in your Bibles, if maybe it's like mine, if you see the Lord, Lord, all capital,
Yes.
That's the Hebrew name for God. So that's a holy name. So when it says God or this or that, if it says Lord in capital Lord, that's translating the Hebrew name of God. So that is kind of a mysterious and holy kind of name. So it says, yeah, it's like a strong tower. So God's like being in fortification. The righteous run into it and are safe. Would somebody be willing to read verses 11 through 15 for us?
I will.
Thank you.
The wealth of the rich is their strong city. In their imagination, it is like a high wall. Before destruction, one's heart is haughty, but humility goes before honor. If one gives answer before hearing, it is folly and shame. The human spirit will endure sickness, but a broken spirit who can bear? An intelligent mind acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge.
Very good. In verse 11, what's the point of a fortified city or a strong city in the Old Testament times? What would be why would people be building fortifications for a city? Protection.
Yeah, survival.
Survival. It tends to be focused on others, right? Because you wouldn't build fortifications unless you were worried by the things around you. Maybe, right? I think why build fortifications if you expect everyone to live in peace? There wouldn't be need for walls and cannons on top of the walls. I mean, Old Testament times, we're not talking about cannons, but you wouldn't need scouts to look, what might happen.
Well, they might come and take not only your possessions, but it was also they would take the women the young and beautiful women, or the women in general.
And they take the men and sell them off to slavery, and very different time in those times. So, if you're going to have a strong city, we're not talking about economic strength. We're talking about fortifications. And if you're going to fortify your city, it's because you're worried about the other people around you. So if we understand that image, then what is verse 11 saying?
I was actually wondering, does verse 11, is it connected to verse 10 on purpose? Like, is it a contrast or no?
So interesting, right, Michelle? Yeah, maybe the placement of these two verses helps us kind of compare and contrast them.
Because it almost feels like saying like God is, I don't know, something about God being the ultimate protection, and like the wealthy are trying to save themselves by building up walls, but it doesn't go on to say like that God can, or that their walls aren't going to save them enough or something. It doesn't say that, but it just, I don't know, there was just this feeling of like, it starts with saying God is where the righteous are safe, and then the wealthy have this fortified city. I don't know, maybe I'm drawing connections that aren't there, but
no, I think it's an interesting compare and contrast. Go ahead, Joyce.
Well, I see that in mind because it says the Lord is a strong fortress. And then in 11, it says the rich man thinks of his wealth as an impregnable defense. So it's kind of
your translation almost lends itself to using 11 or 10 and 11 together, which I like. I love the idea that you would compare and contrast these two, right? So the word of the Lord, God is like being in fortifications, but some people think that's wealth, that helps fortify them against the dangers around them, right?
And it says, what a dreamer. Like, it's not true.
Which verse is that? Because mine doesn't say that. What is it? That's in 11?
At the end of 11, it says, what a dreamer.
Yeah, ours says What'd you say, Michelle?
Oh, because like in the end of 11, it says they imagine it a wall too high to scale. So it's like, haha, you only think that your wall is gonna
Your
save you.
dream.
Haha, you're
Yeah,
imagining
what a
things.
dreamer. Like you
You
think that
dreamer.
wealth is going to protect you when disease comes. But you're funny. That's funny. Well, that's ridiculous. You know,
We have a new ladder.
yeah.
We have a way.
Somebody in your family dies. Guess what money gets you? Nothing. Doesn't
Nothing.
get you anything. So yeah, I love that. I didn't even, because I was taking it in 5 verse parts. I didn't even make the connection between those 2 verses. But I appreciate that all of you did that, because they both deal with a similar image and contrast greatly the wisdom of that image in between God and wealth. So what's one and what's the other?
And interestingly, back to Michelle's piglets, they'll dig a hole under in order to get out. And, that's another, just we sort of go down under sometimes and do things that aren't good in order to avoid the wall.
Yeah.
But the next question, we'll move to 15 and 13. What do those tell us about wisdom? Can my internet's a little funny right here.
You're cutting in and out at times.
Yeah.
You're gone, Chris.
No, I can see it. Oh,
But he's not moving.
It's never done
not
before.
moving.
Nope, he's frozen.
There you are.
Yeah.
Oh, gone
I
again.
apologize. I apologize if there's some issues here with my internet connection, but it's a little unstable, it says, so stay with me. If you can hear me, look at number 13 and 15 and compare what do they tell us about wisdom?
Well, they're both talking about, as someone mentioned, listening before speaking. Truly, and I know I at times tend to do this, perhaps we all do, of we're carrying on a conversation, and while the other person is talking, I'm formulating in my mind my response to them rather than listening to what they're saying. And so this is trying to tell you, don't do that.
Especially number 13 seems to connect with verse 2. A fool takes no understanding, but only in expressing personal opinion. Right?
Mhm.
Now mine is very different. I mean, it says, what a shame, yes, how stupid, to decide before knowing the facts.
That's great. I love the easy language there. Well, stupid, but it didn't sugarcoat what it's saying. It's really stupid to give an answer before you know what.
I can remember going to a national wellness conference one time, and we were doing active listening, and the speaker had us stop what we were saying, and the other person, instead of interrupting us, could then say how they would finish that sentence. And it was so totally different usually than where we were headed. Yeah. And most people found that experience a very good one about listening.
I remember my parents going through active listening back in the late 60s, early 70s, and teaching stuff and all their Bible studies at the church my dad worked at and stuff. So, yep, active listening.
I love the idea that you're saying in mid-sentence and have other people finish your thought. How accurate are they going to be? And yeah, I make that mistake. I have to say that I am guilty of that for sure, where I think I'm going and I try and get them there before when they're not going there at all. They're going somewhere where I think they are. Yeah. And so now the kind of the focal point of what we're going to talk about in the sermon, What do you gather from verse 14? What is that verse? Maybe if you have questions, we can have a couple people read their translation of verse 14. Carol?
Yeah. A healthy spirit conquers adversity, but what can you do when the spirit is crushed?
Healthy spirit conquers adversity. What will you do when the spirit is crushed? Joyce, what does your verse 14 say?
I'm not sure I understand mine. A man's courage can sustain his broken body, but when courage dies, what hope is left?
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
instead of spirit, your Bible translates it courage.
Mine
can
says
through a
your
broken
will
body.
to live
The will to live. The will to live.
can
Through-
sustain you when you're sick, but if you lose it, your last hope is gone.
This, Chris, mine says the human spirit will endure sickness, but a broken spirit who can bear? I've been in isolation with this. We've all been in isolation with COVID now for almost a year. And for those of us who had it, it almost broke me. If I hadn't had contact with my family and my friends by phone, I don't think I could have survived what I did. But it didn't totally break my spirit, but there were times that it came close because it was something I couldn't fix. There was no medication, there was no fix for it except continue moving through it.
Any other reflection on this verse?
I've always had this, it's been highlighted countless times because I think I've felt that so often that when I like the translation of a broken body, because when your body goes haywire, that can be painful and difficult, but I've always been surrounded by people who would kind of come alongside and make sure that, I had the courage or the spirit to not feel isolated and alone. And I don't know, I think it makes a huge difference to see that your broken body can actually put up with just so much more if you have people who help deliver that courage to your spirit.
Right.
And it doesn't always have, someone can't always physically be there, but just, I don't know. I think a crushed spirit is far worse. It's more deadly by far than.
Well, I think it's the courage. It really is saying that courage is the most important thing. To never give up. You know what I'm saying? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And
Michelle has that.
When you were talking earlier about sayings, I had a physician friend of mine tell me that never give up. And I think that's something you can live by. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Never give in to those demons that, bother you.
I
I'm
think
sure-
that I think some of the problem in terms of facing these things is one, if you concentrate on one thing that's a problem, and then you feel another thing is lurking, so you now have two things. And even if you clear those things, you're ready for the next thing, and that gets frustrating. And at that point, we start to wonder if Jesus really loves us, and we know that he does. So the fact is that you need to lean into Jesus, just like I said before. And I think that is something that we all need to do, even for the sickness and so on. We still have a responsibility. If we had nothing else going on in our lives, it's really important, I think.
But that's like you say, Dick, sometimes one thing and all of a sudden our focus is just on those things. And even if they're not going to happen, we imagine them happening.
Right.
We start
Right.
worrying about them. And then all of a sudden, all we are focused on is, I'm not saying that it's wrong. I understand it. It's happened to me. Like this saying, don't do that. Just think about how much God loves you. Yeah, it's really hard to do when another medical appointment tomorrow and your child is sick and your parent is ailing, and suddenly that can impact your spirit. And you know, I think going back to verse 1, you know, somebody who isolates themselves from their community, and community is not something that is available to all of us all the time. There certainly is something about when we open ourselves up to community, there's usually fine, whether it's at, you know, trying to make friends with your schoolers, other parents, to have other people who are going through the same thing, trying to get into a AA program when you're struggling with addiction, being a part of a church or a community organization, but you also believe in the other people. I just think about the people I know who have gone this and health issues, and when they have some sort of a community.
You're gone.
My younger brother, you know, my niece was in the hour and a half from their home for the last week or so, and my younger brother had worked in that area, and his wife lived in that area. They had a friend who opened his house to them. They had a 3-bedroom house to stay in while their dog. They had breakfast, lunch, and dinner brought to their house every day while they were staying there for their daughter. And we as the family couldn't do anything. And they would have been so alone, and so it would have been such a terrible situation, even if they had to stay in a hotel room. But instead they had all these friends pop out in strength. And just think that courage, that spirit that you can, you know, that can come from others, boy, that brought him through, and that got him home. And and it doesn't always happen. It's not something we can like make sure happens in our lives. But boy, when other people dip down to help us out, and just to make sure that we know there, whatever that means, through cards or phone calls or a meal, to edify the spirit, and all of a sudden you can start getting through. But when you think you're and you think it's never going to stop, all of a sudden there's not there. That broken spirit, that lack of courage, the loss of courage. See, how can you maintain that? How can you get through it? Go ahead, Rick.
I'm sure Joyce and Carol both have nursing examples of people they've witnessed who had strong spirits, and that has helped them overcome some seemingly impossible medical situations. And other people who have had broken spirits have had things kind of overtake them that perhaps shouldn't have, when their spirit and their mind and so on is positive or negative, you know, it affects the body.
It's remember my last church, there was a woman in her early 70s, and she started feeling a little weird, and she got a diagnosis of cancer. And it was, this is extremely treatable, and we're going to start a regimen right away. And she told me, I'm gonna die. I have cancer. I'm gonna die. And she died in like a week. You know, no matter what we told her, no, this is treatable. You know, like she made the decision that this was going to take her. And I'm not saying that she would have survived to have treatment or anything like that, but there was no stopping her when she decided to die. It was amazing to me to see that she lost any will to live. This cancer thing, just, she had no hope for anything. And I thought, like, I saw it happen. It was incredible. I was shocked at how quickly it happened. You say, Rick, you know, nurses certainly among us see that kind of stuff all the time.
Well, a funny story that I had in the emergency room was a hunter came in and he had fallen and he said, I broke my arm. So we did everything, we x-rayed it out, his arm was not broken. He refused to accept the fact that his arm wasn't broken. And so, long story short, they finally talked to him and they put like a semi-cast on his arm because he just refused to accept the fact. And he walks out to his friends and he goes, see, I broke my arm. So you can make your own decisions, here, you can make your own decisions.
Hard to think that.
Pardon?
I was going to say, Joyce, it's hard to think that mindset can get you through, especially when you're in physical pain or illness, right? We know medicine really counts for a lot too. It's not just mindset. It's really important. It really is. It's incredible. So that's what this proverb kind of. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to tackle this one on Sunday, but tune in, fine. And I will say, my last question was one that we covered. If you were to try and talk about these proverbs are written for and why they matter, we don't have to think about ancient Israelites.
No.
Think about people who are trying to live faithfully and in community with others. These are good of wisdom to hear. So my challenge to you going forward is chapter of Proverbs in the week to come and read it over. One of the verses that really inspires you or connects with you, and maybe a couple that doesn't seem to get me anywhere. So Proverbs is a rich book. And unlike, maybe Isaiah, which takes you into real deep waters, ebbs and flows. There's some real deep waters there. And then there's some that say, if you're foolish and open your mouth, you might get hit. Okay, that's good advice. I'll just take that on its face. There's no deepness about it. It's just telling you, watch out. So for joining and really appreciate your participation again today. We look forward to seeing you again next. And enjoy some Proverbs in the meantime and asking some of those questions. So
Good to see you all.
Carol, have a great week.
Have a good week.